Hey everyone, in this lecture we're going to be talking about fossils. We've already talked a little bit about fossils when we went over sedimentary rocks and depositional environments, but here's some more information about fossils. So by the end of the section, you should be able to determine what a fossil is and how a fossil is formed. It takes special conditions for an organism to be preserved as a fossil, so it's not surprising to think that our fossil record is not complete. We'll talk briefly about the principles of theory of evolution by natural selection, and we'll go over some examples of extinction or mass extinctions and how they take place and how that helps us determine the fossil record. So remember when we talked about depositional environments? Well, different depositional environments give us clues of what the Earth was like, and different fossils would exist in these different environments. Again, we have continental environments, transitional, and marine environments, and we would expect fossils to be found in only certain regions and certain environments. So that tells us a little bit about the depositional environment based on what fossils are present. So let's talk about the discovery of fossils. If you look at a bedding surface of sedimentary rocks, you might find shapes that resemble shells or bones or even footprints. Paleontologists described thousands of specimens and established a collection of work of all these different fossils. And fossils become a tool for studying geologic history. And actually looking at the progression of fossils tells us a lot about evolution and how that has happened. Here's an example of a skeleton that's 200 million years old in sandstone. Here's a penny for scale. So this tells us a little bit about what sort of species were alive and the type of environment. So if we know something about the rock record there, we'd be able to say that maybe this species was living in a shallow marine setting, or that it probably had gills, or if it were in a or if it had certain other characteristics that we use that we see in animals today, we can apply that to try to understand what species were like in the past. So most fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. And why do you think that is? I'm going to take a pause here, so hopefully you can think about this. Why do you think we only really see fossils in sedimentary rocks? Well, it's because sedimentary rocks are not destroyed. When we have high temperature and pressure through the formation of metamorphic rocks, or even in igneous rocks that requires a lot of temperature variations, those destroy those fossils. And so really we only see fossils in sedimentary rocks, and very infrequently do we see them intact in igneous rocks, and very infrequently do we see them intact in metamorphic rocks. Fossils can be formed when organisms die or are buried, and they create this this imprint in the rock. And the degree of a fossil's preservation reflects the context of burial. So it's the same sort of thing when we talk about how metamorphic rocks are formed, and the degree in which changes occur can tell us about the rock. It's the same of when we look at the fossil record. If it's very churned up or very impartial bits of fossils, for example, or shells, that tells us a little bit about the environment or how it was formed, versus a very well preserved intact whole structure or something. So let's look at some of those examples. Okay, so here is a diagram of forming a fossil, and this is a simplified version. So here we are where dinosaurs exist, and the dinosaur lays down to take a nap. And, you know, when that happens and you take a nap that's longer than expected, the dinosaur then turns into a skeleton, and its bones remain because the flesh either gets eaten by other critters or it rots away. And then say, for example, we have an influx of sea level, and we have sea level rise, and that causes sediment to be buried on top of this skeleton. And over geologic time, more sediment gets piled on and piled on and piled on, and it creates a sequence of beds. And then over even more time, millions of years, a different process takes place, and that section then becomes eroded away and visible to us at the surface. So here we are. Here's a paleontologist with a cool car here, and he's also wearing a hat, so he's very cool. He sees the strata, or she sees the strata at the surface now. So something that occurred over millions of years ago is now being visible to the surface. And one note about this is that it's not that simple, but just imagine the fossils that we see at the surface now and how many more are beneath our feet. And I talked about this briefly before, but this is a project that I actually did as an undergrad using ground penetrating radar, which is a non-invasive way to look at anomalies in the subsurface to possibly detect the existence of dinosaur bones in Morrison, Colorado. Where this is in Morrison is near Red Rocks Amphitheater, if you've been to that area. And near there is a huge outcrop of dinosaur bones and footprints, some really cool fossils. And so we were trying to use geophysics to try to see if there's more bones beneath the surface, which is the exact same thing that they used in Jurassic Park. So the image does not look nearly this good. It looks like maybe a blob. All it does is detect different densities of the subsurface. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the geophysics lecture. But yeah, so as an archaeologist or paleontologist or someone who's studying fossils and dinosaur bones, seeing things at the surface is very rare. And that's because it takes a lot of different processes, and the exact timing for these strata to be made, to the surface through uplift and erosion. So let's talk about a few different types of fossils, and I'll go over examples of each of these. So when you think of fossils, you might think about the dinosaur bones, like I just showed you, or maybe some seashells. But there's a lot of other different types of fossils that exist, and they each kind of hold their own category and importance in the way that we study the subsurface. So we have frozen or dried fossils that are preserved in amber or tar. We have preserved or replaced bones, teeth, and shells. Fossils that can create molds or casts. So it's not the exact fossil itself, but it has created a mold. We have carbonized impressions, permineralized organisms, trace fossils, and chemical fossils. Okay, so here's an example of a mummified baby mammoth from 37,000 years ago. And it's pretty rare to see whole bodies, but you can have whole bodies of organisms that may be preserved. These are fossils that are relatively more young compared to other fossils. So that just has to do with how they present themselves. Like now, if you have something that has been buried and then uplifted or buried to extreme depths and pressures, those fossils may not remain intact. So we see whole organisms generally that are younger in age. So an example of this is we have woolly mammoths can be frozen in the ground through permafrost, or even mummified corpses are dried out in desert climates. So an example that's not too far from here is from the La Brea tar pits. So if you haven't gone and checked that out, that's a really cool place to go. And it's really fun because you get to see some fossils that have been so well preserved. So in LA, near the tar pits, when we have tar preservation, that occurs where oil is seeped into the surface and those gases and volatile components have evaporated away. So all that remains is this like really ooey gooey sticky tar, and it removes a lot of those oxygen from the environment. So that's how they become so well preserved. And so the tar pits have accumulated in a swampy area, and so when it was a swamp, animals would go and check them out and then fall in and just kind of stay there, preserving them for over 40,000 years. So that's a really cool place to go if you haven't checked out La Brea tar pits. Another example of preserved fossils can be seen in amber, where insects land on the bark of a tree, become trapped in sticky sap or resin, and then that then hardens and can preserve insects. So here's a video of the La Brea tar pits. I'm going to hit pause here and hope that you enjoy this little video, and maybe it inspires you to go check it out yourself.
Here, scientists have found the perfect preservative for fossilized remains, the tar pit. The viscous asphalt oozes up from petroleum seeps miles below. The pools resemble freshwater ponds, but they can ensnare an animal that comes too close. In Venezuela, scientists have only just started excavating this set of tar pits, hoping they'll find evidence of North American creatures that migrated south. But working conditions are extreme. Temperatures here typically push to 120 degrees. Humidity is intense. The ground isn't even solid underfoot.
Not only is the air temperature sweltering, but the tar pits are hot as well. So you have the heat from the sun and heat radiating from the tar, so it's overwhelmingly hot.
Despite the challenge, the excavators have learned how to make sense of this muck and mire, extracting ancient fossils, steeping in asphalt for 25,000 years. The asphalt, in effect, pickles the bones, stops the decomposition, and allows their identities to come to light. And that's what paleontologist Ascanio Rincon is counting on.
When we find these fossils in the tar, they're telling us important things about the Great American Interchange. It means there's been contact from the north. In other words, animals coming from the north and eating animals that are in the south.
Several feet down in the tar, Rincon discovers a bone.
It's a big bone, a mastodon femur.
The thigh bone of a stegomastodon, one of the largest mammals ever to walk this land. The elephant-like beast originated in North America some 10 million years ago. But it's turned up thousands of miles to the south and hundreds of generations later, living in Venezuela. The tar has preserved the mastodon bone, but it's still quite fragile. A plaster jacket ensures the bone is safe on the trip from the field to the lab. It will join a growing collection of fossils, all confirming that North American prey animals migrated to South America when the continents joined. And they weren't alone. Where prey went, predators followed. Tracking close behind, some of North America's fiercest carnivores, saber-toothed cats.
Okay, another example is preserved or replaced bones and teeth or shells. And this is where bones and shells consist of a durable mineral, which may survive in a rock. Some bones or shells mineralize and aren't stable, and then they recrystallize. So the shape of the bone or shell can be preserved. An example of this here is a preserved mammoth tooth. And we see a lot of teeth, like you can see a lot of shark's teeth. That's another one of those that you can go on certain hikes in certain areas, go and find dozens of shark teeth. I listened to an interesting presentation about Shark Tooth Hill in the San Joaquin Valley, kind of near Bakersfield area, where there's a really gradual hike and there's an exposure. And if you are patient, you can sift through and find some shark teeth. Okay, next are molds and casts of bodies. So when a shell pushes into a soft sediment, a mold in the shape of the shell can form. And if the inside of the shell then fills with sediment, that forms a cast. And eventually, when that sediment turns into a rock, the mold and cast display the shape of the shell that remains in place, even if the shell itself has dissolved away. There's an example of this. I'll post a video of this, of some fossils that you can see in Magoo State Park. So that's a really great place to see some fossils firsthand. A carbonized impression occurs when the cast produces a soft or semi-soft organism, and there's something like a leaf or insect or feather that falls on top of it. And there's a chemical reaction that removes that organic material, like removes that leaf, and leaving only a thin film of carbon on top of the surface, and it creates that impression. And this is a popular thing to see for fossils, and people seem to have a lot of these types of fossils in their home. If you can find them, with like a pressed-in insect or pressed-in feather, or the example here is an impression of a fern frond that has been imprinted into a shale. We've talked a little bit about petrified wood, and this is an example of a permineralized organism. And it's the process by which minerals precipitate in the porous material, like wood or bone, from the groundwater solution, and it's seeped into those pores and then solidifies. So here's an example of petrified wood. It looks just like a log. However, it's a rock now, and it's so hard compared to the rest of this example here is so hard that the rest of the material around it has completely eroded away. Okay, next are trace fossils, and these include like footprints or burrows, or even dung that has been left behind from organisms. So here's an example of some footprints in the sediment. Okay, chemical fossils. So these are living plants or animals consist of complex organic chemicals. Okay, so when they're buried with sediment and subjected to diagenesis, some of these chemicals are destroyed and some remain intact, but the chemicals break down in a different way. So I talked about diagenesis briefly with depositional environments, and this is just another way that we can understand how these plants or animals, how their organic content changes. So distinct chemicals derived from an organism and preserved in a rock is called a chemical fossil, a molecular fossil, or a biomarker. And this is important for looking at fossil records from drilling a borehole, or for oil and gas applications or groundwater applications, and you're trying to date things. So if you were to drill a hole down a few hundred feet, you would look at the sediment that comes up, and you might be able to identify some of these chemicals within the rock to tell us about what type of chemical is preserved from these organic materials. Okay, so those are some examples of different types of fossils and how they become preserved. But not all living organisms become fossils. And in fact, very few of them become preserved and turn into fossils. And they become preserved through these different ways. So we talked about being in an oxygen poor environment, like in the tar pits. In these environments, the organisms will have a chance to be buried and preserved, so oxygen doesn't destroy them. They are in an anoxic environment. You'd also need a rapid burial. So say, for example, an animal dies, and you'd have scavengers that try to take the bones or move the bones, you'd have to have something buried on top of it very quickly in order for it to be preserved. So an example would be like if a storm suddenly buries an oyster bed with sediment, that would preserve it. That would preserve the intact oyster in that environment. You'd also have to have presence of hard parts. So organisms with durable shells or skeletons are the ones that we see, like shells and oysters and bones. So things that don't have those hard parts are not preserved. Like we have a much better understanding of clams than we do about jellyfish, because jellyfish are not as well preserved because they don't have that shell. So there's a few instances here of what makes a fossil more preserved. Okay, so the fossil record. So there have been decades of science to understand the evolutionary relationship between organisms. And we have a fossil record with over 250,000 species. And do you think that that's sufficient? Do you think that the fossil record is complete? What are your thoughts on that? So just take a quick moment and think about that. How many fossils have we seen? Is that accurate? Well, I've already talked a little bit about special circumstances that you need in order to have a fossil. So I think it goes without saying that our record is not complete. And we have a lot more work to do to try to understand the fossil record. We definitely have not identified every living species right now. I always love to see articles about a new species of fish or something that's been discovered, because it's always baffling to me that we have new species of birds and bugs and all sorts of things that we're still discovering. So with that being said, it's hard to extrapolate that to things that are not living. So if we're identifying new species now, it goes without saying that we definitely have not observed all the previous species that ever existed. We always seem to find new fossils, and scientists have been very creative of ways to identify the differences between these fossils and naming these fossils. Of course, not all organisms are present in the rock record due to their preservation potential, like I just said. There are those really specific circumstances in order for a fossil to be preserved. And of course, fossils only really are seen in sedimentary rocks, and that has to do with the depositional environment and those very special circumstances in order for things to be deposited in order to preserve the fossil record. So, so imagine all these other animals and critters and species that we don't know about just because it was not the right geologic conditions for sediment to be deposited to preserve it. Only when things are exactly in the right conditions do we see fossils. So there's a lot of species that we don't know about or have not been preserved in the record. So let's talk about evolution and extinction. So natural selection was determined from Darwin and others that populations of organisms cannot increase in numbers forever because they're limited by competition for scarce resources in the environment. And only organisms that are capable of survival can pass their characteristics on to the next generation. And each new generation, they have some characteristics that they develop in order to make them more fit for their environment. And those fitter organisms survive and produce offspring. And with that, pass those level of fitness onto their offspring. And those characteristics benefit the next generation. So that's natural selection in a nutshell. And we can see the progression of this in the fossil record. So the theory of evolution is that by studying fossils in sequences and strata, paleontologists are able to observe progression changes in a species, in an assemblage of species through time, and can determine when some species die out or another species appear. And because the fossil record is not complete, the rate at which evolution takes place is not as understood over the course of geologic time. So the way that we describe this is that there seems to be a punctuated equilibrium, which is where evolution occurs in fits and starts, and sometimes it's slow and sometimes it's rapid. It's not a linear progression of evolution. So here are some reasons why it is punctuated and it's not just gradual. We have large events like a sudden mass extinction. We have change of Earth's climate. We have a formation of new environments. And we have an isolation of breeding population. So all of these processes occur over different geologic time intervals. Okay, so when a species vanishes, when extinction occurs, that's when the last member of the species die. So there's a few factors that contribute to the extinction, and I'm going to go over an example of each of these. So first is global climate change, tectonic activity, asteroid or comet impact, basically a volcanic eruption, a large volcanic eruption, appearance of a new predator or competitor. So let's take a look at an example of each. So extinction due to climate change. This is something that we're talking about frequently right now because a lot of our current worldwide temperatures are higher than they've been in the past. So we're seeing an impact of that on species. So the Earth, over the course of the age of the Earth, has experienced many temperature fluctuations. And because of that, species may lose its habitat. And if they are not able to adapt or migrate, that species will disappear. Extinction due to tectonic activity. So tectonic activity causes, an example, vertical movement of the crust over a large region. That means there could also be changes in seafloor spreading and changes about volcanism. So this can contribute to the distribution of an area and the habitat. So some species cannot adapt to that. If their species was at sea level and suddenly now they've been pushed up a few thousand feet and they aren't able to adapt to that, then the species may die off. Extinction to an asteroid or comet impact. Impacts of large meteorites with the Earth have been catastrophic for life. A large impact could send dust and debris into the atmosphere, which would blot out the sun and make the Earth cooler, and therefore changes the habitat. If there's interruption to the food chain, if there's no sun to grow plants, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the geohazard lecture in just a few weeks. Extinction to a volcanic eruption. So several times during Earth history, there's large quantities of lava that spilled out, and therefore it's created huge volumes of ash and gas that spewed into the air and changes the atmosphere. So these eruptions may have altered the climate globally. I'm just thinking back to 2012, maybe, when there was that large volcano in Iceland, and it disrupted air traffic. Planes were grounded in Europe, and it was a really big problem because there was so much ash in the atmosphere. Now think about that on a much larger scale, where the ash covers the Earth completely. Those would be sort of things that that have a global impact. So what about extinction due to new predators? Well, there's a correlation between when humans first were seen and a decrease in large mammal species. So humans were a predator to some species that had never had predators before. So there's an extinction that occurred around 20,000 years ago when humans became predators for these mammals in order for them to survive. So if there's a more efficient competitor, that competitor steals that ecological niche from the weaker species. And we see this, another example of this right now is on the Channel Islands. You have the island fox, and it doesn't really have any predators, so to speak. And so there's so many, like on Santa Cruz Island, you see all these island foxes everywhere because they don't really have any predators. So that's an example of where a species is thriving. But if, say, you were to put a coyote or something on the island, the coyote might eat those foxes and wipe out an entire species. Okay, a mass extinction event. There have been at least 5 that's happened during the Earth's history that have been recorded through the fossil record as well as rock records. And these events are how we break up some of our geologic time. So when we talk about the different eras and eons and periods and things like that in geologic time, they usually correspond to some of these really large events. And this is how we break apart describing those things. We're going to talk a bit more about the KT boundary. That's what it's called, the KT mass extinction. And that's the comet that hit Mexico that wiped out all the dinosaurs. And so the KT stands for the separation between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary in geologic time, those different intervals. So we have record of other mass extinction events. So the OT mass extinction, and so this is a rough hand of what those symbols mean, or not the symbols, the letters mean in geologic time. So we have the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and so on and so forth. And these events can often separate out geologic time intervals. Okay, so we've talked a lot about fossils and how fossils have formed. We talked about the conditions in which fossils are formed and how it takes a really special set of circumstances in order to get a fossil. We talked briefly about evolution and natural selection, how that impacts the way that we interpret the fossil record. And we talked about extinction and where extinction takes place. So that's it for this lecture. See you next time.